Bitcoin is a crime in the form of a service. That's the harsh criticism coming from the Bank of Italy, which is really going after Bitcoin. We're seeing the next Bitcoin attack, this time from Italy. They're even calling for a complete ban on certain Bitcoin exchanges. Let's take a look at what's behind this. We also see that Bitwise has now applied for a Bitcoin corporate ETF for companies with over 1,000 Bitcoins. Stacy Herbert says that this is the suddenly moment, the moment when Bitcoin's development is rapidly moving forward. We'll take a look at that too. But before we get to this crazy new Bitcoin ETF, let's take a quick look at what's going on in Italy. The Bank of Italy criticized Bitcoin platforms, viewing exchanges without clear KYC restrictions critically. The banking sector feels attacked by crypto exchanges, especially those abroad with lower standards. So, exchanges without clear KYC restrictions are viewed critically. The banking sector feels attacked. Bitcoin peer-to-peer transactions can't be regulated the same way. And that's totally understandable in 2021 because the banking sector, including the Bank of Italy and other banks, feels attacked. Banks have very high reporting standards, and when any crypto or Bitcoin exchanges pop up, especially those based abroad that don't have such high standards or regulations, the banks feel threatened. But you have to understand that Bitcoin peer-to-peer transactions can't really be regulated in the same way. And that's ultimately exactly what they want to address here. But you just have to understand that Bitcoin peer-to-peer can't really be regulated here. And that's basically exactly what they want to do here. They want to regulate peer-to-peer exchanges of thousands of Bitcoins. So if I send you something, peer-to-peer marketplaces, if you exchange euros or dollars for Bitcoin on a peer-to-peer marketplace, you can do that anonymously. I can, for instance, if I exchange euros or dollars for Bitcoin, I can do that relatively anonymously. For example, I can simply arrange to meet with you. I can say, hey, we'll meet at 3 o'clock today. I'll give you 1,000 euros. In return, you send me the share that represents, let's say, Bitcoin 2001 in value to my private Bitcoin wallet here. And something like that can be done completely anonymously. There are also exchanges where you can do things like that without KYC. I always have to be a bit careful when promoting things like this, because then the YouTube channel can be blocked pretty quickly, and so on. This topic is crucial because you can't just buy Bitcoin on regulated exchanges. You can also use marketplaces or offline services like HODL or Peach. You can buy Bitcoin without registration, but be cautious when discussing these topics on YouTube. Buying Bitcoin without KYC has pros and cons. You're outside the regulated framework with more anonymity, but cashing out at a bank can be problematic, keeping you within the Bitcoin ecosystem. The Bank of Italy accuses these services of money laundering, criminalizing Bitcoin, which isn't criminal. The EU and upcoming MiCA regulation aim to regulate unhosted wallets more strictly, increasing KYC requirements and costs. The Bank of Italy wants platforms heavily regulated or banned. A report on Binance highlights money laundering using platforms in countries with weak laws or high-risk classifications by the Financial Action Task Force. If you want to cash out at a bank or something like that, it usually means you have to stay within the Bitcoin ecosystem. The Bank of Italy is essentially accusing these service providers of money laundering, claiming that it's all for criminals. They're criminalizing Bitcoin again. And that's a really big problem because Bitcoin isn't criminal at all. Even if someone wants to maintain their anonymity, that's also what the EU is trying to do, or what the upcoming MiCA regulation is about, where you might not be allowed to have unhosted wallets anymore. Well, you might still be allowed to have them to some extent, but it will be more strictly regulated, and the KYC requirements will increase. That also means that costs will go up because exchanges will have more work to do. And that's ultimately the big thorn in the side of the Bank of Italy. They want to clearly dictate that platforms should be heavily regulated. And if they're not heavily regulated, then those platforms should ideally be banned. It says here in another report about Binance that money laundering often uses platforms in countries with weak anti-money laundering laws or those classified as high-risk countries by the Financial Action Task Force. So she clearly says here that we need to implement massive regulations worldwide. We need to close every loophole. You can see this as good or bad, but the trend we're seeing is that the EU wants to regulate more, and now Italy wants to regulate more too. They also wanted to introduce unrealized taxes on Bitcoin gains. Fortunately, that was abolished. But we're seeing more and more of these excesses where people are demanding that we need to tax unrealized gains. We need to ban it. We need to impose strict limitations. And the thing is, you don't always have to impose a ban. you don't necessarily have to say, hey, we're banning Bitcoin. You just make the regulations so tough that it's really hard to send Bitcoin back and forth. So people end up leaving their Bitcoin on exchanges. They might only buy their Bitcoin on some ETF platforms, and all the trading happens in derivatives of Bitcoin, completely destroying the whole peer-to-peer market. I always recommend 21 Bitcoin down below. Feel free to check it out. You can still get up to 20% off the fees when buying Bitcoin with the code Bitcoin Hotel. But it's really important here that you have to register because it's a regulated company. And like I said, registration and KYC have their pros and cons. For example, if someone decides to buy no KYC Bitcoin, that's completely legitimate. I also tell a lot of people to always have a little stash of no KYC Bitcoin. It can never hurt. Unfortunately, it's also true that by 2025, some exchanges will likely see regulations and, let's say, oversight becoming significantly stricter with the MiCA license or the MiCA regulation here in Europe. So, there will definitely be some changes at one or another exchange. I'll also update here if anything changes with 20 Bitcoin or if there are any major changes in general. For example, starting December 30th, Tether stablecoins, like USDT, won't be allowed to be listed in Europe anymore, or they'll only be very limited in how they're listed. So you really have to be careful here, especially if you're holding stablecoins, because you might not be able to keep them on exchanges or sell or trade them anymore. And something really interesting has happened here. The asset manager Bitwise has filed an application for an ETF that aims to represent companies with Bitcoin strategies. If you're holding stablecoins, you might not be able to keep them on exchanges or sell or trade them anymore. And then something really interesting happened here. The asset manager Bitwise filed an application for an ETF that aims to represent companies with Bitcoin strategies. The ETF would include corporations that hold more than 1,000 Bitcoin and have a market capitalization of over $100 million. This is interesting because more companies like MicroStrategy, Mara, and Similar Scientific have a Bitcoin strategy, bundling firms holding over 1,000 Bitcoin. Corporations now have an incentive to hold at least 1,000 Bitcoin, encouraging smaller companies to do the same to be included in an ETF. Inclusion in this ETF means passive flows and high demand from institutional investors. So, there's now a bigger incentive for small companies to hold 1,000 Bitcoin because then they can get into this ETF. If they're in this ETF, they get passive flows, and from institutional circles, it's also being heard that this ETF is really in high demand, and a lot of institutional investors are very eager for it. Stacy Herbert even says here, this is the suddenly part, I guess. So this shades them here that this is now the suddenly part of 2021. She also mentions extraordinary times, and that's always the story of Bitcoin. Slowly but surely, the adoption happens. And then there's a suddenly moment where, let's say, the adoption really takes off. According to Stacy Herbert, we've now reached such a suddenly moment because a lot of things are happening right now, like for example. And then there's a suddenly moment where, let's say, the adoption really takes off. And according to Stacy Herbert, we've now reached a suddenly moment because a lot of things are happening, like for example, that the MicroStrategy bond ETFs were requested for approval just yesterday. Bitwise ETFs and Bitcoin reserve strategy could impact adoption, says Stacy Herbert. Russia's Bitcoin trade aims to catch up to the U.S. So, there are now various things coming in quick succession that, according to Stacy Herbert, could change something in the adoption process. Also, with the nation-state FOMO that's currently happening in the background with Russia, what's going on geopolitically is that they're now engaging in international trade with Bitcoin. They really have to catch up to the U.S. because Russia has already indirectly announced that they have large Bitcoin holdings as of 2021. Personally, I don't see the big suddenly moment yet. For me, that big moment will start when America first posts or publicly announces, hey folks, we've bought Bitcoin and we're going to keep buying Bitcoin every month from now on. If such a report ever comes out, that's when my suddenly moment begins, because then other nations will start buying Bitcoin in moderation. It's been said for a long time now, since 2021, when such a report comes out, that's when my suddenly moment begins, because then other nations will start buying Bitcoin in moderation. It's been said for a long time now, since 2021. I think the first one I saw was Nawal, who back in 2013 or so said that the nation that starts buying Bitcoin with printed money is going to turn the whole game 180 degrees. Michael Saylor keeps saying it too. The first nation that buys Bitcoin with printed money is going to change the whole game and take Bitcoin to a whole new level. And I think this could really be the sudden moment. But I could be wrong. So feel free to write in the comments whether you think we're already in a suddenly phase or what the suddenly moment will be. Right now, it doesn't really look to me like we're fully in the sudden phase. We're not really in a state of euphoria yet, but it's interesting what's happening behind the scenes. But the price doesn't really reflect all the stories that are happening behind the scenes right now. A lot of people might not really understand what's going on because there's a lot of stuff happening that's not so easy to grasp. But Anthony Pompliano had a really good take on this. 2021. What's coming our way in 2025?
Can Bitcoin continue to perform better in 2025?
I think Bitcoin will perform better. When you look at a number of positive factors, you can see that the ETFs bringing in hundreds of billions of dollars are playing a role. You can also see that nation-states are starting to buy Bitcoin. The US is talking about a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Plus, in 2025, there will be a much friendlier regulatory environment, and on top of that, there are companies that are also buying a lot of Bitcoin. And when you look at these positive factors, it's a boom, and people get nervous when the price drops. But if you look back at the last two bull markets, we've seen 13 different instances where there was a drop of 10% or more during this Bitcoin bull market. And that's totally normal. People don't need to worry. Bitcoin is going to perform really well in 2025.
Well, there's talk that Donald Trump is supposedly proposing a massive Bitcoin reserve worth $280 trillion, basically to save the dollar. What do you think about that? And what will it do to the price of Bitcoin?
I think there are two differences here. The first question is the dollar in trouble? And the answer to that question is no, not so far. We have a problem with national debt, and there could be issues with the dollar in the future if we have to devalue it to monetize that debt. But right now, the dollar remains very popular worldwide. The people at dollar. We see this with the use of stable coins and other things on an international level. The second question, and a very important one, is should the United States buy Bitcoin for its strategic Bitcoin reserve? I think the answer to that is yes. Other countries are already buying Bitcoin. There will only ever be 21 million available. And the risk of investing hundreds of billions of dollars in Bitcoin is drastically outweighed by the potential upside. If the United States wants to be a leader in this area, then they need to hold Bitcoin on their balance sheet. In 2021, if Bitcoin is good for individuals and businesses, it will also be great for the United States. I have 20 seconds. Do you see the current drop as a buying opportunity? Anytime Bitcoin has fallen and you bought it and held it until now, that's been very good. And I think that people who invest in Bitcoin regularly are going to do really well.
So I have to say, I'm feeling very relaxed about 2025. I definitely think that the Bitcoin ETF inflows are probably going to be even crazier next year than this year. I'm definitely counting on that. Institutional adoption will move forward. Nation-state adoption will move forward. How many nations are really going to officially join in now? I'm not counting on it being a full-on FOMO situation just yet. But I definitely think that maybe 2 or 3 relevant countries will join in. Then we'll see more millionaires and billionaires opening up to Bitcoin again. More and more people are going to check it out. At the same time, the fiat system will continue to get into difficulties, into trouble. This will also massively strengthen Bitcoin. So, there's really no need to worry about that. And even if there are pullbacks here, they're just short-term pullbacks. Even if we drift into a bear market in 2025, that won't be a problem. If we have another year or 2 of a bear market, then it'll just go back up afterward. But I'm not talking about a severe bear market, because a lot of people are already expecting the bear market to start in 2025. So my base scenario is that 2025 will actually be an even stronger year than 2024. It's always been the case that the second year after the halving, not the halving year itself, but the year after, has been stronger than the year in which the halving took place. I'll also give you a link to Bitcoin below where you can buy Bitcoin. With the code Bitcoin Hotel, you get up to 20% off the fees when buying Bitcoin. Let me know what you think about the current sentiment here regarding the attacks from Italy, and on the other hand, the bullish stories that are happening around Bitcoin right now. Until then, peace out.